Hello, and welcome to our Zoom education session on enhancing communication. My name is Chris Van Leuven, and with me today is Shelby Berry, and we are education coordinators here at the Alzheimer's Society of Peterborough, Kawartha Lakes, Northumberland, and Haliburton. To start, I want to thank you for joining us. This education session is designed to help care partners, family, and friends supporting people who live with dementia to identify and understand changes in communication that can often happen as a result of brain changes. Together, we're going to learn some tips and strategies for making communication more successful. Before we get going, I just wanted to mention some housekeeping items. Although Zoom technology is wonderful, I do find that I'm not always able to see everyone's faces or the chat box when I'm sharing my screen, which means that I'm not always able to tell, or I'm not always aware when someone's trying to get my attention. This is a fairly interactive presentation, so I appreciate your patience if you're trying to respond to a question or ask a question and I'm not seeing you. It is helpful if you use the raise hand function, which you can find in the bottom right-hand menu with the emoji reactions. If I miss your hand up, don't worry, as Shelby and I will be sure to open the floor up to questions at the end of the presentation, and I will stop sharing my screen at that time. Now to start, I want to ask you a few questions to get you thinking. Have you ever forgotten something you were going to say? Have you been in the middle of a conversation and trailed off because you lost your train of thought? Have you forgotten the name of a person, a place, or an object, even if only for momentarily? Have you ever found yourself stuck trying to understand the punchline of a joke, or tripped over your words so they came out jumbled? Communication sometimes fails us for a variety of different reasons. When it does, we often feel embarrassed, silly, or frustrated. Loss of communication can make us feel a little vulnerable. What happens if something like your ability to communicate is taken away from you and you have no choice in the matter? In order to understand what we might go through when communication is lost, we need to look at the role that communication plays in our day-to-day lives. Let's start with some of the basics of communication. What is communication? Well, communication is the exchange of information or messages between two or more people. Information can be shared in different forms, including through speech, through signals or gestures, in a written form, or through behavior. Communication is essential when we're trying to establish and develop relationships with others. Communication involves both the intentional and sometimes the unintentional sharing of ideas and thoughts. Communication relies on the cooperation of those participating in the dialogue, conversation, or exchange of information to adapt to each other's level of knowledge, their attitudes, and their stress level. Communication happens in two main ways: verbal and nonverbal. Verbal communication is all about the words that we use to exchange information with each other. We're most conscious of our verbal communication. We're usually quite aware of the words that we use and how we use them. Nonverbal communication is all about our body language or body talk, and it includes things like our eye contact, our facial expression, the gestures that we use, our tone of voice, the proximity to which we're communicating with another person, our touch, and our posture. Nonverbal communication tends to convey our true emotions and how we may be feeling or responding at any given time. As human beings, we can do a good job of faking our words, but it's very difficult to fake our body language. What we know is that people living with dementia or another type of brain disorder may gradually lose the ability to use and understand language and words. However, their nonverbal abilities last well into the disease process. And we're going to talk more about this later. The communication process has two important components. The first is sending the message, and the second is understanding or receiving the message. For sending the message, or what's often referred to as message production, there's 3 steps. The first is formation, and that's the process of having an idea. At this point, the message is still in brain language, and it's not yet in words. The second step is translation, and that refers to the process of giving this idea a linguistic form, or more simply, we're putting it into words. And the third step is expression. And this is when the nervous system gets involved. The nervous system coordinates our breathing, our voice, the movement of the muscles in our head, especially our tongue and our lips, so that we can represent our idea in words. The second component is that understanding of the message, or what's referred to as comprehension, and that also has 3 steps. The first step here is perception, and that's when our brain is involved in hearing sounds or seeing written forms or hand signs. The second step is translation. So during this process, the sounds and the images that we perceive must be translated back into a form that's meaningful to our brain. And the third step is inference. And during this step, the brain understands the meaning of the message. This process is similar when it comes to communicating through signs like American Sign Language, writing, or other means of communication. Broken down into these basic steps, sending and receiving a message is a very detailed and intricate process. What if a cognitive change affects this communication process? What might that look like, and what might it feel like? I'm now going to take us through an activity to kind of simulate what a loss of communication might feel like. We're going to take the next few minutes to go through an interesting little scenario to help us understand what it might feel like to have barriers to communication. So I'm kind of going to be telling you a story through this, and it's a story where you put yourself into the first person or character's perspective. You suddenly find yourself in a foreign city. Imagine it's a modern city that looks like any other Canadian or American city, but the language is different and the signs are in a different alphabet. You don't know where you are or why you're here. And while you're in the city, you decide to go for a walk to find a bank and a grocery store. After a short period of walking, you decide to get a taxi to ensure that you can get there before closing time. You notice a busy street ahead and you go towards it. As you reach the road, you see a wall with 2 gates in it. To try and hail a cab, you need to take one of the gates. The first gate is marked with sign A, and the second with sign B. There's sign A and sign B up on your screen. Both of these signs are written in an alphabet that you don't recognize. So you decide to pick a gate at random, not knowing what lies behind it. Unfortunately, after passing through gate 1, which is marked with sign A, you are immediately struck down by a speeding car. As you're lying beside the road, a truck comes by and takes you to a building that's marked with sign C. Here's sign C. You're taken inside this building that's marked with sign C, and there's lots of busy people inside, and you're not entirely sure of what they're saying. The people appear to be very professional, however, so you do take their direction. Someone hands you a glass container and points you towards 2 doors. Through interesting nonverbal motions, you get the impression that you're supposed to give this person a urine sample. When you get closer to the doors, you notice signs on each of them. Both have letters missing, but contain the same number of characters, and you're unsure what might be the most appropriate one for you to use. There they are, signs D and E, which you can see on the screen, mark the 2 doors in front of you. Which one do you think would lead you to the washroom? As the signs are written in an alphabet that you can't make sense of, you make a random guess for the second time and you choose the door marked with sign E. It's dark and it's cold in there. And since you can't find a light switch, You turn around and leave to try the other door. Upon entering the room marked with sign D, you are aware that it's a washroom, but you feel uncomfortable because you're not sure who else might walk in on you. Shortly after you've turned in your sample, a tall, muscular person comes and puts you in a wheelchair. And as you're being taken to the sidewalk in front of the building, you assume that you can leave. You try to convey the questions, how do I get to the bank from here? And the person waves and makes gestures in the air in a way that you think directs you. It's now 5 minutes to 5, so you head in the general direction of where you're being waved. When you reach the end of the block, you see a building that might have a bank in it. There are 2 signs on the main door. One points upstairs and the other points downstairs. You look at sign F and sign G. Which do you pick? Only one's going to get you to the bank before it closes. So there's sign F and sign G that are marking staircases. Unfortunately, by the time you make up your mind and decide which sign to follow, it's too late and the bank is closing. You decide to return to where you're staying. You walk back towards where you can get a cab, and it dawns on you, in order to get a cab, you're going to need some money. Throwing your hands up in frustration, you decide to walk back, sore, out of money and hungry, and you suddenly realize that you are not at all sure as to where you're staying. All right, so here is the actual signs. So these signs are made up of different real alphabets. So the first one, remember you were seeing, you came to 2 gates to try and decide which one to take, that you would need to take to find a cab. So sign A says no entry and sign B says exit. And then you're put in a truck, so we're assuming an ambulance, and it takes you to a building with sign C that says hospital in Hebrew characters. At this point in the story, you are directed to give a urine sample and you are pointed towards 2 doors, and you choose door E first, and it's dark and it's cold and you can't find the light switch. And it actually has taken you into the morgue. So then you retreat and you try door D. And then at the end of the story, you come to 2 stairwells that have 2 different signs, and one of them says groceries and one of them says bank, but it's already past closing time for the bank by the time you decide. So that was a pretty long story that you were kind of immersed in there. And I want to ask, and feel free to unmute yourself and shout out an answer, or you can raise your hand, or you can put an answer in the chat box. But what did you feel as we were going through that scenario?
I'm not going to travel.
Dudley says, I'm not going anywhere unless they speak English. Gail says in the chat that it was feeling frustrating because you couldn't. What, Gail, if I could dive into that a little bit more, what was so frustrating about that? Oh, Chris says that she was felt a little lost in that scenario. And Gail says it's frustrating because you don't know where to go.
I think it enhances confusion.
Yes, it makes you feel even more confused when you can't understand the language and you can't read the language, right? So in that scenario, you are at a loss because you can't understand the language. You're not able to read signs. If somebody's giving you directions, they're having to do it all non-verbally. But who could you have asked for help?
I think that there lays the challenge because nobody speaks the language, right?
Yeah, you're feeling quite at a loss for who to ask for help. Thanks, Tracy. Yes, and then, you know, even if you did decide that you were going to ask maybe the orderly that was putting you in the wheelchair, that you did ask for directions, how do you convey what it is you're trying to ask or what it is you're trying to say when there's that language barrier? It's very tricky. And I see Zarina put in the chat, it's what people who live with dementia feel and go through. It's that barrier to communication when, we've had some changes to our brain and to our capabilities when it comes to communication. And just having that, so all those emotions that you felt going through this, feeling reluctance to want to travel anywhere, or maybe that translates to feeling reluctance to wanting to go out and socialize because you know that you have barriers to communication, feeling frustration, feeling lost. We can imagine, having those barriers to communication or having lost some of our language, what that would feel like and the kinds of challenges that would pose. Thank you so much for going through that simulation with me. I'm going to pass things over to Shelby now, and we're going to elaborate a little bit more on the communication difficulties.
Great, thanks, Chris. There we go. So yes, thank you for participating in that simulation exercise. I'm sure you'll agree that it has a lot of impact. It also helps us to understand the reactions that we can have when our ability to communicate is impaired or changed or compromised in some way. The Strange Ways exercise also provides a nice segue into talking about the communication difficulties that may be experienced by people living with dementia. Communication difficulties are a common challenge if a person has dementia or another brain disorder that affects their speech, their comprehension, or perhaps both. Hitting some here, there we go. These difficulties can create frustration, agitation, and anger, and they may lead to withdrawal from conversations or social settings. So, those feelings may cause the person to not want to be involved in a social conversation. People living with dementia may have trouble expressing themselves and making themselves understood by others. They may not understand what others are saying to them, so they may have a hard time with that comprehension. And they may also not understand what is expected of them. So if they're having a hard time, understanding what others are saying, they may also have a hard time understanding what maybe we're asking them to do or trying to, assist them with doing. So I'm going to lead us through another exercise. So all you need for this exercise is a piece of paper and a pen or pencil to participate. So I'll give you a moment to grab those. Hopefully you have it handy. See, going across, I see people grabbing some stuff, or you already have something there. Okay. All right, it looks like everyone has a piece of paper and something to write with. So I'm going to start off with this exercise. So everyone has their paper and pencil, which is great. So I want you to follow these directions. I will not respond to questions or repeat instructions for the purpose of the exercise. Okay, so here we go. At the bottom of the page, I want you to draw 2 squares about 3 inches apart. At the bottom of these squares, draw a series of half circles. At the top of and joining both squares, draw a rectangle. At the top right corner of the rectangle, I want you to draw a circle, the diameter of which is about the same depth of the rectangle. Now, if that position, I want you to draw an S, half in and half out of the circle. Now I want you to draw 1 inch from the first. On the top left curve of the circle, I want you to draw another circle, a smaller one, smaller than the first, half in and half out of the first circle. I want you to draw an S Attach to the top left corner of the rectangle. Now within the larger circle, draw two ovals, one inside the other smaller bit being in the lower part of the larger one. Okay, those were the instructions. So since I gave you all the same instructions, you should end up with something that looks like this. Now I can't see any of you, but does your drawing look like mine? And if not, you can unmute to share, you can share in the chat. What went wrong? Why doesn't your drawing look like my drawing?
I couldn't hear some of the, you put your head down. I couldn't hear some of the instructions. You were blowing your nose. And I probably did the pictures too small. I didn't use the whole page. Okay. Yeah.
Okay, yes, yes.
I missed a few instructions. Yeah.
Yeah. Any other thoughts of what went wrong? You talked too fast.
Mhm.
Yes, so I was doing a lot of things that made communication difficult. I was turning my back, I was going out of the frame, I was talking too fast, I was blowing my nose and mumbling my voice. Yes. How did you feel during that exercise?
Very frustrated.
Very frustrated, yes.
Nice car.
If it wasn't for the understanding the purpose of the exercise fairly early on, if I was someone who didn't understand that, I probably would have been almost, I would get angry that you weren't communicating effectively for me to understand.
Yeah, you feel angry, you know, that I asked you to do something and to follow along, and then I wasn't very good at communicating with you. Yeah.
I'm not an angry person, by the way.
Well, there you go. So there we go. Even the most patient people, this exercise can get them riled up. Did anyone give up, or did you want to give up or just walk out, toss your pen down?
I did.
You did? Yeah. Yeah.
Very
yeah.
quickly.
Very quickly, yes. Probably by the third instruction.
FaceTime video.
Yeah. Oh, got some crickets here. And then Gail said partway through, I quit. Yeah, yeah. So this is another exercise that we use to try to, provide that stimulation to give participants a sense of how a person with dementia may feel when communication goes wrong and how easily communication, can go wrong. Some things like talking fast, we might be doing naturally without really realizing it. So that's just, again, another exercise to kind of help maybe bring some feeling into how the person be experiencing communication. So I'm just going to mute a couple people here as we dive into the content. So as I mentioned, the activity we just went through illustrates the importance of good communication by highlighting some key problems that can happen in our conversations. So for example, speaking too quickly, mumbling, turning away from the person, so not making that eye contact, or maybe we're using ambiguous language that's hard for the person to understand. So now we're going to look at some general tips and strategies for enhancing communication with someone who has dementia, so that we can try to make this communication as successful as we can for everyone that's involved. So the first tip here is to set the stage. So we really want to, set things up for success from the very beginning if we can. So here we want to consider our environment around us. Are there any distractions? Is the TV on? Is the radio on? Is there other background noise? Are we in a, kind of a busy spot with others talking, where communication might be more difficult? So with permission, we can ask to turn down the TV or the radio, or maybe move to a quieter spot because we want to be able to have that conversation with the person. The second one here, we want to get the person's attention. So make that eye contact if it's, culturally appropriate, so that we know that, so the person knows that we're talking to them. And it can be helpful to use their name, so just using their first name can always be really helpful for getting their attention, so that they know that it's them that we're speaking with. We also want to sit or stand facing the person that we're talking to at the level that they're at. So if they're walking, we can walk with them. If they're standing, we can, stand beside them. If they're sitting or if they're in a wheelchair, we can, sit at their level. We don't want to feel that we're towering over or speaking down to someone. So speaking to them at their level is really important. We also want to make sure that we approach the person from the front so that we don't startle them. So a change that can happen with dementia is the peripheral vision can be affected and can narrow. So a person with dementia may not be able to see to the side like they once could. They might have more of that narrowed tunnel vision. So again, it can be more helpful to approach from the front, because approaching from the back or the side may startle the person. We also want to speak slowly and clearly because this really helps us to be a good communicator. We also articulate our message much more clearly when we slow down, and we take that time. But we also, it can be a fine line. We also don't want to come across as if we're talking in, a kindergarten voice, or talking to the person as if they're a child. We still need to talk with that respect to it, like we are talking to an adult, but again, slowing it down so that they can process that information better. It's not necessary to speak loudly or to elevate, the volume of our voice. In fact, a lower tone of voice is often much better for someone who's listening to our message. We also don't want to assume that just because a person has dementia that they have a hearing impairment as well. So we don't want to raise our voice, based on that assumption either. We want to use simple words, so this isn't the time to bring out, kind of long, our long spelling bee words. We want to try to keep things simple. And try to avoid using pronouns like she, his, theirs, it. Due to the short-term memory loss, we may be talking about our daughter, and perhaps we used our name or her name earlier in the sentence, and now we're referring to her as she. But the person with dementia may, because of the short-term memory loss, may not recall who we are talking about. So they might be saying, who is she? Or thinking that. So using people's names and trying to avoid using pronouns can be helpful. Also, if we're saying, perhaps we're saying on the couch and we're asking the person to pass us the remote and we say, it's right there, they may not be attaching that, knowing that it means the remote that you're talking about. Figures of speech and slang terms can also be difficult for the person to understand because they can take that literally. So saying, it's raining cats and dogs, or that dress is a knockout, those types of things can be very confusing because abstract thinking is affected with dementia. We also want to try our best to give one message at a time. We want to try to think about it as giving one idea per sentence. Okay, so it's very easy for us to, speak fast and give too much information. We may be saying, maybe we're suggesting to the person with dementia that, maybe they go and change out of their pajamas because, someone's coming over for a morning coffee. Maybe instead of just using that initial, could you go change, into your clothes? We go, because so-and-so is coming over for a morning coffee and they got a new dog and the dog's so small and it's so cute, and we kind of can go on and on and on, give too many details. And then we might see it on the person's face, oh, I've given too much information. Or maybe they go and sit down as if they're going to have a cup of coffee because that's what they got out of that. So again, we want to really try to make sure we're giving one message at a time before we move on, and check in to see if they're understanding as well before we move on. Show and talk. So gestures and pointing to objects in the environment can be helpful for getting your message across. The person may forget the meaning of words, so visual cueing can really help to trigger recognition. So you might want to ask, would you like something to drink? Well, doing that motion or holding up, a glass of an empty glass to help get that point across. Perhaps we're trying to get the person to go for a walk. So it might be helpful to hold up their coat, open the door. So as best we can, kind of adding those additional things in that can really help get our message across, especially if words and then processing words has become more difficult for the person. Be patient. So we know that this is easier said than done as we recognize the challenges that we may face in the caregiving role. But it's important to recognize that being patient is extremely helpful for the person with dementia, because as the brain continues to change, the processing can slow right down. So if we are patient, if we're saying things more slowly, if we aren't making the person feel rushed, maybe you have a doctor's appointment you need to get to and you're kind of standing there, arms crossed and tapping your foot, sending all of those messages that you're feeling impatient, they can notice that. And, that can add to their feelings of stress and make it harder for communication. So when communicating with people living with dementia, we say, always remember the 30-second rule. So response times can be significantly slowed by the effects of both the disease and drugs. So on average, it takes the person living with dementia up to 30 seconds to take in what's been asked of them or said to them, to process that information with a damaged brain, and then to formulate and deliver, a response, and a response that we think the other person is looking for. So again, we want to give the person that time to process and try to understand what's been said to them and to respond. And when we think about it, if we stop and were to count to 30 seconds is actually a lot longer than we realize. And we're often likely to interject, and to maybe rephrase because we think the person's not understanding, but then they have to start that processing all over again. So practice that pause, practice the 30-second rule, and see if that is helpful. We also want to try to respond to emotions and not words. So sometimes it is best to respond to the emotions that the person is displaying rather than the words that they are saying. In other words, it can be more important to listen to how a person is saying something rather than what they are saying. So the person could be, looking down, they could be teary, but they could still manage to say, I'm fine. But their body language and their words, they don't match up. And we know that they're not fine just by their nonverbal communication. So we want to exercise that active listening wherever possible. Take into account all the clues, the emotions, and the nonverbal messages that the person is communicating, as well as the words. So we often say, listen with your ears and your heart, so what are you sensing in that communication? And also avoid jumping to the end assumption of what they're going to say, because we can miss important information and messages along the way. Okay, this is a big and common one. So avoid arguing or reasoning. So it's important to avoid arguing or reasoning with the person with dementia because their ability to reason is impaired, and it's often impaired early on. in the dementia diagnosis. So due to their loss of insight and awareness, they may not be able to see things from your point of view, and to use the appropriate reasoning and judgment, that we're using, with a healthy brain. So instead of saying, yes, you do have a doctor's appointment today, you could try saying, I'm sorry, I forgot to tell you about your doctor's appointment today. Instead of saying, why would anyone want to take your purse? You could try saying, oh, that's someone took your purse. Let me help you take a look for that. Okay, so arguing and reasoning because of the changes that are happening in the brain can often lead to a power struggle. So we want to be aware of that. And do not talk about the person as if they are not present. So we're going to talk about this a little bit more later, but it's always important to include the person with dementia in the conversation, and we hear caregivers sharing with us that this happens quite commonly. It could be at the doctor's office where the doctor's talking to the care partner instead of the person with dementia. It could be maybe at church, maybe other social settings where friends and those around us are approaching and talking to the caregiver and not the person living with dementia. So, it can be hurtful not to include the person or to talk about them when they're physically there, as if they're not present. Eliminate but from your vocabulary. So this is an interesting one. So the word but can be really a barrier for any further conversation with a person. When we use the word but in response to the person with dementia, it tends to, or really anyone, it tends to negate what they have said and the point that they are trying to make. The word but can really shut down the lines of communication by implying that, what they've just said is maybe incorrect or not true or not of value. So instead, we can try to use words like also or nevertheless or yes and instead to share your perspective or other details that the person may need to know. So kind of adding to what they said instead. This will help to keep the conversation going in a more respectful way. Use touch if appropriate, to the situation or to the person. If touch is used thoughtfully, appropriately, and with permission, it can really help to calm a person and to connect with that person, so we can really use touch to maybe help comfort someone if we can tell that they need that comfort. So we want to use that where we see it would be beneficial. Another one that can be easier said than done is try not to take it personally. So this can be really difficult, but it's important to know that people living with dementia may say or do things that they wouldn't have said or wouldn't have done before. Dementia affects judgment and reasoning due to the damage that's happening in the frontal lobe of the brain. And again, sometimes this reasoning and judgment can be affected early on. So we have to understand that their filters may not be working effectively in the way that they were before, and they may have lost their social inhibitions due to changes in the brain. And what can be really tricky here sometimes is that the person with dementia may also not realize the impact that their actions have on others, in particular those closest to them. So one of the changes that can be affected here can be changes with their empathy, and their empathy may be impacted. So again, as best as we can, we want to try not to take that personally, because we know what that person was like before their diagnosis, and they didn't want to hurt us for the world. Never quiz the person. So here, we do not want to we feel like we're testing or questioning the person and their ability to remember. For people living with dementia, you know, they have shared that this can be embarrassing and upsetting and frustrating. And it may cause, you know, a defensive or an angry response. And due to the short-term memory loss, you know, they may not remember those details of the day that we might be asking them about, you know. So as much as we want to know, you know, what did you have for lunch at this spot? Who was there? You know, what did you talk about? Sometimes it's a lot harder to get that information without feeling that we're testing the person, and it can be upsetting for them. We also want to do our best to be consistent in verbal and nonverbal, our verbal and nonverbal communication. So remember that people with dementia have increasing difficulty understanding verbal messages, but nonverbal understanding continues until late into the disease. So, you know, they're still taking in that nonverbal information. So for example, if a person has their arms folded and a frown on their face, and they say, I'm not mad, you know, we can tell based on their body, their tone, that frown, that they are mad. You know, we're interpreting that question differently based on their nonverbal communication. So we want to do our best to make sure that their nonverbal communication matches, you know, what you're saying. So we know that our words and how we say our words are important for effective communication. Our body language and our actions are equally important as well, if not more important, for people living with dementia. So let's try a quick exercise here. So I want you to, oh, where did I go? There I am. So I want you to watch and follow along with me here. So if everyone can just hold their arm up like this and make kind of the okay sign with your hand. Great. Okay, now I would like you to touch your forehead, touch your ear, and touch your chin. All right, that was interesting. I'm seeing some laughing and some giggling. Yes. So did you touch your chin like I said, or did you touch your cheek like I demonstrated? So I saw some people going like, oh, like kind of, they did catch it a bit. Some people went right to their cheek. Some people did go to their chin. But oftentimes we do see people kind of going to their cheek there and following what I did. So even though everyone agrees, you know, nonverbal communication is important, you know, it's surprising how easily we follow actions, you know, over words. So just a nice little exercise there to reiterate that. And we'll just go back to our tips here and look at our last tip. So our last tip here is to validate and explore their reality. So validation is all about stepping into the person with dementia's shoes and exploring their reality. So wherever possible, avoid the urge to correct the person and bring them into the here and now reality. When a person has short-term memory loss, their brain is often accessing past information or long-term memories when there's damage to the memory centers of the brain. Our best approach is try to, you know, enter their reality, see things from their perspective, and validate their feelings and emotions. So saying, you know, you've lost your purse. Well, now I understand why you are so upset. Instead of saying, well, you've just forgotten it and left it somewhere again, which could cause the person to feel, you know, further upset. And Chris, this is a good segue. Chris is now going to speak a little bit more about validation.
Yeah, thanks, Shelby. So yeah, let's talk a little bit more about validation and what it is. So there was a social worker in the US, her name's Naomi Fell, and she first coined the term validation therapy as an approach to understanding the reality of a person living with dementia in order to better facilitate communication and support. Validation is one of the most important communication strategies that we can use with people living with dementia, particularly in times when they're feeling, maybe a little more anxious or confused or upset. Validation provides important feedback to the other person that you've understood their feelings and the meaning of their message, and that you're making every attempt to understand what it is that they're trying to communicate. In order to validate, you respond to the person by stating the meaning and the feeling behind their message in your own words. So sometimes we refer to this as summarizing or paraphrasing their words, and it's almost a check-in with them that you've understood correctly. Validation also means that you step into their shoes to try and determine what it is that they're experiencing, or how they might be seeing a particular situation from their viewpoint. In other words, you meet them where they're at and you explore their sense of reality without making that attempt to bring them into our here and now reality. When we use validation as a communication strategy, it helps us to enhance rapport, trust, and safety in the conversation. And it provides an opportunity for the other person to feel successful. What should you do when you really don't understand the message that they're trying to send? Firstly, it's really important that you don't let the person think that you understand. You really have to clarify. If you say that you understand when you really don't, you risk losing the person's trust. You may anger the person, particularly if they're expecting you to do something and then you don't follow through on it. One approach that can be helpful is to acknowledge what's happening by saying something like, "Oh, this is frustrating, isn't it? You can't find the words that you want, and I'm having difficulty understanding what you mean. I'm sorry, let's try again." Another tip is to apologize if you're not able to understand their message, and to simply ask them to repeat their message. You can also look for other clues that the person might be giving you and respond to their emotion if their words are difficult to understand. Positive feedback goes a really long way. So let the person know that they're doing a great job trying to communicate their message. When they know that you are supporting them by giving them a little boost to their confidence, sometimes that helps to make it easier on their part to communicate. They feel more comfortable, they might feel more confident, and really that good rapport that you're building is everything. Let's see how helpful the information about communication was for you today, and if it's increased your confidence level when communicating with a person living with dementia. We have a few scenarios that we'd like to go through with you, and based on what you've learned today, you can determine what strategy you would take in each situation. All right, so here's the first one. You're trying to get some work done. Your spouse approaches you and asks what time their daughter's coming to pick them up. This is the fourth time they've asked you in the last 5 minutes. What should you do? A, tell them that you've already answered their questions several times and request that they try to not ask again for 15 minutes. B, respond to their question by using a slightly different explanation since the first few times they didn't seem to understand. Or C, respond to their question in the same calm, reassuring way that you've answered each previous time. You can shout out A, B, or C, or you can throw it out in the chat.
C.
Very easy to lose your patience.
Yeah, so Hilda said C in the chat, and I've heard of a couple people say C. So as Shelby was going through those communication tips, I'm not sure that everyone caught this one explanation that she gave, but whereas B seems like a good fallback, and is often what we try and do when we think somebody hasn't heard us or hasn't understood the first time, it's our natural inclination to rephrase that question or that sentence that we'd said, right? If I explain it in different words, or if I say it in a different way, that'll help their understanding. But it's different when somebody's living with dementia, because they have difficulty with processing and it takes them longer to process. If you rephrase what it was, if you rephrase that message that you'd already said, then it's like they feel like they have to start at the beginning because the message sounds brand new to them. So that 30 seconds processing time, they're starting from square one and they're having to start understanding the message, and formulating their response to that message all over again. So you're better to use the same language each time. So that's why C is the better answer here, is to use that same language that you've used every time you've answered, and just to, try and remember to stay patient and stay calm. All right. Next, Arlo is sitting in the living room. Standing directly behind him in a loud voice, you tell him that it's time for you to take him to his doctor's appointment. He doesn't respond to you, even after you repeat yourself. Which answer best explains his behavior and how you should respond? A, he probably hears you, but he doesn't want to go to the doctor. You need to take him by the arm and bring him to the car. B, he's not clued into the fact that you're talking to him because he cannot see you. You should walk around to where you can face him, say his name, and tell him again. Or C, he's hard of hearing and grouchy. It's better not to say anything to him and just lead him to the car.
B.
B, I'm hearing a lot of B. I've seen B in the chat, lots of B in the chat. Yes, that's correct. So sometimes people living with dementia, they do lose that peripheral vision. If you can stand in their line of vision, approach from the front kind of calmly. We don't want to march up on somebody because that can seem intimidating, but make sure that you're in their line of sight and not standing behind or to the periphery. And again, following those communication tips that Shelby went through, saying their name, saying, Arlo, just so you know, it's time for us to go to your doctor's appointment. So he can see you. He knows you're addressing him because you've used his name. That's going to be the most effective communication in this type of scenario.
Chris, I have a question.
Sure.
So the previous scenario, I just brought to mind, oftentimes when I'm communicating with the parent that I'm dealing with, they ask a lot of, like in a 30-minute conversation, it's how are you doing, like multiple times. So is that, in my mind, he's not going to remember how I'm doing, but he still wants to know how I'm doing. His brain's telling him he needs to keep asking because that's what he's done. Is consistency important in that, or does it really matter because he's really not going to remember? Will his brain just say, because he likes the detail of, like, I try to switch it to what's going on, but I'm not sure where to, you know what I mean? Like I'm trying to switch to something simple, but then he asks again, so I'm not sure where to go with that.
So he's saying, how are you doing? And you're not getting away with a, I'm good type of answer. He's wanting you to expand on that.
Yeah. And if I tell him something, I try to make it light and exciting, something familiar for him. And he gets a good chuckle, and then we'll go to something else. And then next, he'll say, so how are you doing? So it's just kind of, okay, do I say the same thing again? Or should I give him another story that will make his day and make him laugh?
I always opt for the story that's going to make his day and make him laugh, because that sounds like, it's sounding like he really just maybe it's not even the how are you doing, it's he wants to hear you share with him and he wants to have that connection with you. That's kind of what I'm taking from what you're saying. It sounds like he's asking because he really enjoys just hearing your voice. So he wants to hear all about your day and how you are doing. So
okay, so I'm doing okay with that one. I just thought I read that one and I'm like, oh, should I be?
No, it sounds like you're doing amazing. And as you say, like if you're telling him stories and making him laugh is the number one option every time, hands down.
Okay.
Thank you for your question, Tracy. I appreciate that.
You're welcome.
Okay, our next scenario. You are requesting Shirley's usual help setting the table for lunch and have explained that there's going to be 5 places to set. Each place setting needs a knife, a fork, and spoon. And when she's finished that, there will be 5 glasses of tea to pour. Shirley looks at you and says she doesn't want help today, or she doesn't want to help today. What could be her reason for not wanting to help? A, she's probably insulted that you explained all of the necessary steps to her and thinks you're treating her like a child. B, she's forgotten that this is her usual job task. Or C, she's been given too many tasks to process all at once and feels overwhelmed.
C,
Yes, everybody's on it, saying C. Yes, so as Shelby mentioned in those communication tips, we want to keep it simple. So we want to use simple language. We want to give one direction at a time so that we're not overwhelming the person with too much information at once or too many asks at one time. Great job. Next, Shimiso is a great storyteller who entertains her peers in the reminiscence group with interesting tales about her earlier years. It's easy to believe what she says because she tells her stories convincingly. One day she tells the group how you and her go way back together and she remembers you when you were very young. You're surprised since you've only known Shimiso for the past year. How should you react? A, orient her to reality, correcting the facts. B, let her talk, enjoy the story. Or C, tell Shimiso that you must remind her of somebody from her hometown.
B,
B.
Hey, you guys are on it today. Good stuff. Yes, so this scenario is an example of confabulation. And confabulation is a common symptom of those living with dementia. And it's defined as the creation of false memories in the absence of intentions of deception. Individuals who confabulate have no recognition that the information being relayed to others is fabricated. So simply put, confabulation isn't lying. Confabulators have no reason to tell a lie and they don't realize that they're not telling the truth. Their brains have simply filled in some missing spots with false information. So their brains are working to kind of fill in the gaps. And that's why they may end up confabulating in a story. This is our last one. Our last scenario here. So Marco has dementia and short-term memory loss. He's asking to see his sister. You know that his sister Margaret died a week ago. Marco continues to ask for his sister. Do you, A, tell Marco very nicely that you're sorry that his sister has died and comfort him? B, talk with Marco about his sister and help him to reminisce about his sister? Or C, ignore Marco. You know he'll stop asking eventually.
B, redirect.
B, yes, redirect, yes. So if we tell Marco that his sister has died, that may upset him. And since he has short-term memory loss, he may forget that you've told him that his sister has died and become upset each time that you have to relay that message. Another piece here, you know that his sister Margaret has died, but you may be unaware that he has another sister still living. Marco was asking for his sister and not Margaret specifically, so you may lead him to believe that another sister has died. And finally, it's really important for us to look at the emotion behind the message. So Marco might be asking for his sister since he's maybe confused or doesn't know where he is. He might just be looking for something or somebody that's familiar to him. He may be lonely, he may be bored. There can be a number of reasons why he might be asking for his sister. So yes, you guys were very quick to jump on B. So yeah, just having that conversation with him and connecting with him, maybe about some memories from his past. So as we approach the end of our presentation today, I'm going to hand things back to Shelby.
Great, thanks, Chris. So we've covered a lot of information in our time together today. It's important that we remember that communication varies from person to person. So here we just have a few things that we want you to remember and take with you. So each person is unique. That communication will vary from person to person. It can also vary from one time to the next, depending on the person's mood, their health, your approach, the task, and the environment around them. So take all of these things into consideration when communicating with the person living with dementia. When language is lost, the innate ability to communicate by emotion, expression, and touch is still with us. So we want to make sure that we keep that in mind too. Likewise, feelings remain despite any communication losses or challenges. And we often perceive those feelings that remain and those emotions through a lot of our nonverbal behavior. So often we send that message nonverbally of how we're feeling before we maybe come up with the words that we want to say. And finally, always remember to include the person in conversation, even if you don't know or you don't think they understand. Don't talk about the person when they are in the room. Talk to them. Being ignored is worse than not understanding or not being understood. When you include the person, they always have the option of withdrawing from the conversation if they are uncomfortable or not interested, or perhaps, overwhelmed by that conversation. But we have to give them that option first. So just a few things to remember there. So we've noticed with our virtual education that we've had a lot of people joining who may not be linked with the Alzheimer's Society, be a client of the Alzheimer's Society. So if you are living and supporting someone with dementia, we know, that sometimes that is not easy, and we want you to know that you are not alone and that the Alzheimer's Society is here to help. We have a range of supportive services that are designed to assist you. And on this slide, you can see our intake coordinator, Maddie. And she is your first point of contact with the Alzheimer's Society. And she can connect you, have a conversation with you, hear your story, and connect you with the right person and the right resources to meet your needs. So if your first way of connecting with us is through this virtual education, but you want to learn more about what we do and what is available to you, please do not hesitate to connect with Maddie and start that conversation. Okay, thank you. I'm going to stop recording and we'll take any questions that you may have.